This is long awaited. It's been almost a year or so since HUD hinted that there'd be some updates to the notice, so we were happy to see it and glad to see the final production or form of it.
Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can hear all the buzz around multifamily housing, with all the info you need to help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Hi, I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Let's get started. On the BuzzHouse, we've had a number of episodes over the last couple of years talking about public housing repositioning, including various notices and opportunities to assist with the repositioning efforts. Along those lines, we are very excited to have someone many of you around the public housing space know well, Greg Byrne, join us today to talk about the new supplement to the RAD Notice issued at the end of July, along with learning what else Greg is seeing right now in the public housing repositioning space. Greg currently is the proprietor of Greg Byrne Consulting and has 40 years in the public housing program, oftentimes working on bridging the gap between public housing and other multifamily housing programs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Garrick to jump into our conversation with Greg. Garrick?
All right, thanks, Don. And Greg, welcome to the show. To begin, would you please just tell us and our listeners a little bit about your professional background and what you're currently doing with your consulting?
Yeah, sure, Gary. I'm lucky that both early in my career and then throughout, where I seem to be in the right place at the right time. By the time I was 32 years old, I was running the housing authority in Dade County / Miami, Florida. And a few years later, I was overseeing the Congressional Public Housing Operating Cost Study. And then a few years after that, came to HUD to oversee the operating fund program and what was the new operating fund rule. And then after that, RAD. But it all seemed to be progressive, this experience, and a little bit destined in a weird way, as if I was supposed to be there. And I retired from HUD in 2021. And for the last 2 years, I've been out working, trying to do two things. One, by the time I left the office of recap and overseeing the RAD transactions, I felt, hey, things are well along in terms of converting public housing to Section 8, but I wasn't thrilled with the pace. That I still felt like there's a lot more that PHAs could be doing. I've been dabbling with both being able to play a little bit on the policy front and have a voice to shout out, but also trying to help PHAs make just good decisions, thinking about what to do with their property. So that's a little about where I come from.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for what you're doing with all the PHAs out there. I feel the same way. I think the pace needs to pick up. So without further ado, let's talk about RAD, for instance. So would you be able to jump in and give us a couple of key takeaways from the supplement to this RAD notice that just came out at the end of July?
Yeah, so this is long awaited. It's been almost a year or so since HUD hinted that there'd be some updates to the notice. So we were happy to see it and glad to see the final production or form of it. I think first and foremost, I think what you have to say about it is it's just another example of the Office of Recap innovating and improving. Talk about wearing the white hat, that these are good government, trying to find ways to get this program operating on all four cylinders. So that's again, pleasing that there's an office inside HUD that is just alive and is listening and trying to make the best of a program for which the Congress didn't give it great authority to begin with, right? It said, here's a program for which we're not giving you any funding. So good luck. Do whatever you can do with that. So that hats off to the recap office and others in HUD and PIH to be able to get the notice published. But the other I think you have to as a takeaway from the RAD notice is to say just more examples of ways to get public housing and then also PRACS, the Project Rental Assistance Program, over to Section 8. And you see HUD bending over backwards, trying to find more ways to say, with limited statutory authority, how can we get more of this product onto Section 8? And big picture, to me, is there any more handwriting on the wall that's needed, right? To let the world know okay, we tried the public housing program for 70 or 80 years. It's time to shift platforms. And I think that's, to me, is the big takeaway from the notice, just continued, let's get public housing onto Section 8.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Greg. Greg, very specifically, Section 3 of the supplement addresses energy efficiency and climate resiliency. And we know there's a lot out there, other programs and Inflation Reduction Act, other things. Greg, in your discussions with PHAs, have you seen housing authorities proactively tackling climate resiliency and energy efficiency, or where do you think the industry kind of stands?
You say proactively? Some. For those who are doing stuff around energy, it's mostly because of incentives that HUD gives, or at times where it's required. And actually the RAD notice, the new notice, does a little bit of both here, to say. And so if you go into the public housing program and you say, what have PHAs done really with regard to energy efficiency? The big tool has been ESCOs, energy service companies, and energy performance contracts, EPCs. And for those of us who believe that public housing should move to Section 8, the ESCOs, which have done, and EPCs, which have done a lot of stuff, it's just the wrong model. It's a bad model because it's good only in the context of public housing. You're able to raise a certain amount of energy improvements, and HUD helps fund that by increasing your operating subsidy. But the terms aren't as great as what you could find if you're in multifamily or in Section 8, because the leveraging is often shorter loans. And if I was a multifamily owner and I was trying to recapitalize my property, I'd be looking at a 30 or 35-year or 40-year loan. And energy PCs haven't really been that. They don't have the same leveraging terms. So there's been a lot of work over the years in public housing through energy performance contracts. But again, there's a better model, and the better model is really trying to refinance your property in more conventional ways, and both taking care of energy work as well as other rehabilitation work. But that was the tool that was available. In terms of climate resiliency, I think we're all entering into new territory. And the HUD had the webinar just recently on the new RAD notice, and the PowerPoint that they present has a picture when it gets to the climate resiliency section, and it's of residents in about 3 feet of water as they're walking, trying to get into their building, which they can't get into because it's flooded. And I actually think the picture is from New Bern, North Carolina. And I know a little bit about New Bern because they have sister projects. And one project they renovated under RAD maybe 5 or 6 years ago, major modernization. And the other project, they haven't quite figured out how to finance yet. That's the project for which the picture is from. And I hope that what happened is when they renovated the first project that they took into consideration through, and they would have been required to because they would have had to do an environmental review, issues of flooding and whatnot. But for the second project, to say whatever it was, the hurricane or tropical storm that came through North Carolina a couple of years ago that caused that flooding where the picture was taken, is to say, is it on everybody's minds? Yeah, right? Is there anything a housing authority can particularly do right now on its own under the current funding? There's nothing. What is New Bern going to do for a project that is in a floodplain, and how's it going to raise the elevation 2 or 3 feet or whatever is need to be required under the public housing program? It's impossible. The only way I can do this is if I find some way to recapitalize the property and either tear it down and build new, or go get a bunch of money to renovate and all. And RAD helps you do that and all. But that said, again, there's no money that is in the public housing pot or whatever to do it. You need to deal with, even communities like New Bern and whatnot, to deal with climate change resiliency. It's big ticket stuff. And so I think, yeah, people are more sensitive to it, but still there's a cost. And the only way you're going to do that is by most likely leveraging, like through Section 8, the equity in your properties, but then having to bring in some other sources of funds like tax credits or something like that, because otherwise who can afford to do it? It's a really tough situation. But everyone's clearly more sensitive than they were before. We had situations where PHAs, under RAD, that you have to do, again, this environmental review. And PHAs, for example, figured when they did the environmental review, they realized that they were not in a floodplain, they were in a floodway. And the floodway is the most dangerous part of the flood zone. and floodplain. And there's an overriding rule which says you use federal funds or have a federal project in a floodway. But this had been going on for 60 or 70 years. Just the PHA, I don't know why, but they'd never done an environmental review before. At first they said, you guys are making us do this because it's RAD. It had nothing to do with RAD. You should have been doing this all along. But that said, once they identified that they were in a floodway, then they actually, in that point, they decided they just needed to turn the keys in and to say, we're going to have to voucher this property out because there's nothing we can do. And so at least now the residents are safe and they're not in the property anymore. But it was this sort of a really unawareness going back 5 or 10 years ago. And people are certainly more sensitive now.
Very good. Thanks for those observations, Greg. That was helpful. Hey, switching gears a little bit, Greg, we took a look through your website and just saw a number of interesting papers that you either wrote or co-authored with others. One topic that we hear a lot of discussion and debate about, of course, is Section 18. And you're looking at its history and the topic of functional obsolescence, which you address in one of your papers you co-authored. Greg, would you be able to give an overview of the argument or point of your paper around functional obsolescence?
Yeah, sure. And first, let me say, it's nice of you that you poked around the website and read these papers. You're probably the only person in the country that has. And several of those ones I wrote just as I left HUD. And there were topics that some people just didn't want to talk about or whatever. And when I leave the building, HUD, it's easier for me to now talk about some things. But we'll get to obsolescence in a minute. But one of those papers was, for example, the PBV program, project-based voucher program, which is a big part of conversion. And it still bothers me that for the Section 8 PBV program, whether it's a RAD conversion or it's part of Section 18, that I keep saying we being as if I'm at HUD, I'm not at HUD anymore, but HUD doesn't really yet have a monitoring mechanism for these PBV projects. And in one of those papers, I argue why there ought to be a better oversight system, just like there's an oversight system for HUD's multifamily projects, that particularly when the case of any RAD conversion, that there needs to be a better monitoring and management reviews of the PBVs. Anyway, but let's go to obsolescence. I'm very passionate about this topic, and it's easy to get me riled up on it. What you've got these, at least in my estimate, about a couple 100,000 units still of public housing properties that were built in the 40s and 50s, some even in the 30s. And there's nothing clearly in the guidance that HUD issues on Section. So Section 18 is the section of the statute that governs the demolition and disposition of public housing. And the implementing regulations and guidance that HUD has issued doesn't have anything clearly marked out for what we call functional obsolescence. So it's clear that if the building is physically distressed, and we measure that by, are the existing capital needs, do they exceed roughly 60 or 62% of total development costs, then that's functionally obsolete, and that's the standard, and you get to demolish it or tear it down, and most importantly, you're eligible for a Section 8 voucher, right? And what PHAs have done over the past 15 years is in many times that once you get that sort of award, or once you get that designation that it's eligible for Section 18, then you get those Section 8 tenant protection vouchers. And lo and behold, you can project-base those vouchers. You actually don't have to give them to the tenants. If you still have to accommodate the residents, but if you can find a way to project-base them and either preserve the property by rehabbing it or by tearing it down and building new and using those Section 8 rents as the inherent underlying operating subsidy for those units, you can do that. You can project basis. That's what most PHAs, when they have obsolete projects, are trying to do, is get through the Section 18 door, get the Section 8 tenant protection vouchers, and somehow project base them, and it will help refinance the property. But we've got to go through this drill, and this drill that says you got to prove that the buildings are physically obsolete, and that physical obsolescence doesn't recognize the fact that these buildings may have really outdated designs that stigmatize the communities, that there's no air conditioning in the buildings, that the unit sizes are tiny, that there's no closet space. And you can go on to say, or that the layout of the property doesn't really lend itself to defensible space and whatnot. These were communities that were built outside the standards by which sort of the world of multifamily housing built. They weren't well-designed sort of projects. But the only way I can more or less get approved for Section 18 is for these older projects is to prove only physical obsolescence without acknowledging all this functional obsolescence. I get on my soapbox with this paper and say, it's time to recognize. In fact, we should just declare all of this stuff from the 30s, 40s, and 50s as functionally obsolete and give PHAs so they don't have to waste money having to do physical obsolescence studies. But more importantly, they can plan. Like every PHA in the country today could know, I got one of those projects, I can be approved for Section 18 just by raising my hand. And that will facilitate much better community planning because I can go out to the community and say, listen, HUD's going to give me Section 18 infection vouchers. I don't have to go through any sort of costly study. And now let's figure out what's the best thing to do for this. But what happens in a lot of PHAs is because they're afraid of the cost of the physical obsolescence study or whether HUD will not approve the application, that they don't do the planning for the recapitalization of the property, because what if they get people's expectations up and then it gets shut down by HUD? And we just ought to acknowledge we've gotten our money's worth from these properties in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And for those PHAs that have been able to prop them up, God bless them, but they should all be declared functionally obsolete and let the local communities know that they'll get Section 8 vouchers. And if they want to project base them or if they want to issue the residents, but let them plan for the repurposing of those communities. Wrote it with Rob Hazelton from Dominion Due Diligence. And we tend to get receptive when we run into people at conferences. Hey, I read the paper, something like that thing. Yeah, great. But we haven't heard much from the policy people of HUD about what their feelings are yet. They're still being a little too coy, in my view.
Thanks, Greg. And hopefully some of those policymakers are going to be listening to this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hear that argument. Let's go a little deeper here with RAD. Obviously, post-creation RAD's been over 10 years. I know you've done a lot of work in that area. So what do you see as the biggest questions and biggest hurdles that come up with housing authorities considering repositioning using RAD, Section 8, the RAD Section 8 blend, or other programs?
It's remarkable that it's been 10 or more years, right? I think the original RAD statute was 2011 or 12, I forget the year. And the first conversion, I think, happened in 2013. Wow, we've been more a decade worth of experience. And HUD, both when I was there and then since then, we've pumped out all this literature, right? It wasn't particularly well planned because we didn't know what was going to happen in a couple of years. But to say, and I know there's some sense of fatigue among some housing authorities saying, first you come out with RAD, then there's the RAD Section 18 blends, and there's the ozone boost for projects converting to PBRA. And I can't keep up with you, HUD. But all that was well intended. HUD tried to provide PHAs as much tools. So there's some PHAs who are like, wow, you're throwing a lot at us. But still, it's been 10 years. And the part that I find hard is that there's still a large percentage of what I believe housing authorities that seem to not know and somehow not really understand the basic tools and not know how they work. And it's like, how could you not, right? Is it that you don't know, or is there just a really large percentage of the community, of the public housing community, even though about a third of the units are counted for as far as the RAD conversions, either converted or have signed up, submitted applications, but we've still got 2/3 left that haven't registered or signed up for RAD. And it seems like this last 2/3, still a lot, is much harder than the first third. Like, how do we get to this group? Is it really a lack of information? Is it, have people just tuned out? I get challenged by this. I really don't know the answer. Is it more communication, or is there something else going on here? And every once in a while, I'll also run into PHAs that have such misunderstanding at times of the program too, that I still can't quite understand what that's about. But from afar, in my view, and again, this is pretty dramatic or whatever, is I wish we could be at a stage where we just could agree, let's get it all over onto Section 8 platform. RAD was a demonstration. It's been, again, over 10 years worth of experience. There's been 170,000 units that have converted. There's been, what's the latest figure? 17 billion in construction activity. And it's just an enormous number. Haven't we learned that the Section 8 program really is a better tool to finance and preserve housing that we tried in 1937? We didn't have any sort of examples to draw upon. So the initial Housing Act of 37 was the best thinking at the time. But over the years, things started to evolve, and then you had the different efforts to try to create a better model, and you had the 236 program and the BMIR program, and you had rents up and RAP and other stuff. And finally, the Congress in 74 said, okay, we're shutting all that other stuff down. Here's a new model. It's called Section 8. And here's a deep subsidy program. We'll make up the difference between whatever the contract rent is and tenant rent payments. And we'll see whether that's enough to really entice the private sector to get involved. And it really did, right? It made an enormous difference. And it's a great sort of financing production program. You give people a long-term subsidy contract that has built-in increases for inflation. That's what a lender or investor needs in order to be confident to underwrite and pledge capital to it. And there's nothing like it in the public housing program. First of all, there's not even a contract rent. You walk up to an apartment building in public housing, you see a high-rise, and you say, you're visiting with your mother who needs housing or whatever it is, and you say, can you tell me what on that second floor, what that one-bedroom apartment, what the contract rent is? The manager would look at you like you're crazy. What do you mean? We get an operating subsidy, we get a capital fund subsidy, and no, there's tenant rents, but we don't even have anything equivalent to a rent. There's not an acknowledged rent for that unit that the government says will make up the difference between tenant and what you do. So in public housing, we don't have that. And we don't have long-term subsidy contracts. It's an annual contributions contract. And so it's not a 20-year commitment like you have in Section 8. And there's no promise that we're going to fund you or we're going to give you an increase every year equal to inflation. Every year, housing authorities have to get on their knees in front of the Congress and say, will you please fill my operating subsidy in my capital fund bucket? And in any one year, Congress will say, how about taking 90 cents on the dollar or 75 cents? You never know from one year to the next. And who as a lender wants to be part of that game? No one does, right? It's confusing and it's complicated. There was this RAD demonstration program. And within 10 years, 170,000 units are converted and whatever the enormous number of capital funds that have been done. Isn't it time now to say we've proved it and we'll move on? How do we get to that place? Again, you see the RAD Notice like doing everything it can to add a little sweetener or a little sort of additional provision here to make the program work a little bit better and encourage more people to do it. But fundamentally, where we really should be spending our energies, in my view, is to say, okay, now it's proven. Now, how do we get the rest of the inventory over? Let's get it done. Let's forget the demonstration. We've proved it. Now, public housing over a period of 10 years, let's develop a plan to close out the public housing program. That's really my view, is enough tinkering. We shouldn't have different subsidy programs, and we should be just one subsidy program. It's called Section 8, and we all ought to be doing it. But unfortunately, there isn't the will right yet to do that. So we still have to pretend like we're demonstrating. I don't know what more we need to do to demonstrate. We've proven enough. And in fact, I think we're making it a little bit worse because we keep adding things to becoming a boutique program. And you don't want it to be a boutique program. You want it to be mainstream. And it's getting harder all along. What's it going to take to do that? Is it going to take some large philanthropy or some big institution that doesn't have any skin in the game just commission a study or bring a bunch of big thinkers together and publish some report and say, here's what we think should be done? Or is it going to require someone on the Hill to pass something in an appropriation bill and say, now that we've had 10 years of this, here's $3 or $5 million for some reputable institution to give us a plan to complete it. And let's really have one subsidy program. But you can't, no, just nobody's willing to say that yet. Anyway, I'm willing to say it. I got enough. So that's really my thing. And let's simplify it. We actually have so many choices now between the Section 18 and RAD and streamlined voluntary conversion. And all of those are well understood in the sense that there are ways that the department has tried to say the message from the 10th floor being the Secretary's office over the years saying, we know we have limited authority, do everything you can to find a way to help PHAs get to Section 8 because we don't have the blanket authority to convert everything. And people meet and they think up, and one of the ones is that the tools that PHAs have is this quirky thing called streamlined voluntary conversion, right? Because someone smart enough in the HUD building said, there's a program that's on the books called voluntary conversion, and it gives HUD latitude to actually simplify things for classes of PHAs. And someone in the building thought up, why don't we, for classes of PHA, okay, why don't we, for the whole class of PHAs that have 250 units or less, let's make them automatically eligible for the spring called streamlined voluntary conversion and get them onto the Section 8. But because the statute, the way it's written, we can't project base it without getting tenant consent. And so that's why I say it's a little quirky, but it's well intended. But again, all these different flavors, it'd be best if it was just one program and everyone just, 10 years, we're going to convert everything to Section 8. And why not? It makes good policy sense.
Very good. Greg, thank you for that and all those observations and just saying it like you feel it. We like that.
It's easy to do here. Thanks for creating the environment for me to sound off.
Yeah. And hey, one last question. It might be a little bit counter to like simplifying it, having one program, because the question is, are there any silver bullets, policy modifications? Again, I know it's counter to what you just said, but is there one or two things in your mind that could make it more enticing, inviting?
Don, you're right that I've kind of put myself in a corner on those previous answers, but we're likely many years away from such larger policy reform. So let me see if I can bring myself down to earth. The first thing I want to say as a way of wrap up is, again, a thanks to HUD and the Office of Recapitalization for demonstrating once more their commitment to improving the RAD program, for which we in the industry are enormously thankful. But on the margins, here are a few other items on my Christmas wish list. First, as mentioned before, I'd like to see all pre-1960 public housing properties automatically qualify for Section 18 under functional obsolescence. This would greatly help PHAs in planning the redevelopment of those properties. Second, I'd love to see if the Congress could create a as of right in the 4% tax credit program for public housing recapitalizations. In this way, PHAs wouldn't have to worry about bond caps, which again would help with property planning. And finally, I'd like to see HUD make it even easier for the smallest agencies to convert, which would include allowing them to carry over their operating reserves if they convert via Section 18 or SVC, or to grandfather their current funding if it exceeds 110% of the FMR in low rent markets. The more we can eliminate the static for these agencies, the better.
Greg, thank you very much for that. A lot of good information, a lot of great insight. So that's it for another episode of the BuzzHouse today. A big thanks to Greg Byrne for joining the show to give us an overview of the new supplement to the RAD Notice, among other topics around public housing repositioning. Once again, I'm Don Bernards.
And I'm Garrick Gibson.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.